Well, shalom, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rabbi Andrew from Rosh Hashanah Messianic Congregation, and welcome to our weekly Torah study. This week, we're going to be looking at Numbers chapter 30. The weekly reading for this week is actually a double portion. The first part of it is called Mattot, which means tribes, and because the verse 1 of Numbers 30 says, Moses spoke to the princes of the tribes. Okay, so it's called tribes, Mattot. And that's the first part. The second part is called Parshat Maseh, which means journeying. And it has to do with the journeying of Israel. It's the end of the book of Numbers, actually, that we're coming to. So just quickly, one question that people have sometimes is, why do we have these double portions? Well, briefly to explain that, it's because the Torah, since ancient times, these readings were divided into 54 different parashot or portions. And so to be able to read them all in the year, sometimes they need to be doubled because you may only have 50 or 51 weekly Sabbaths in the year. So you can't read all 54 unless you double some of them. And then the other thing is that sometimes on the weekly Sabbath, it might be a holiday like Passover or Sukkot or something. And there are special readings for that holiday. So the weekly reading would then be deferred till the next week. And then again, you'd have a double portion. And there are 7 of these double portions possible, by the way. And this is one of them this week. So we're going to be looking at Numbers 30 verses 2 to 16 this evening. And one of the main areas that's covered here, or the main area that's covered, has to do with vows and oaths. So before we begin, I want to clarify some terms. And I'm going to put them up on the screen here. Here are the 2 different terms in Hebrew for vow and oath. These are what are covered in this chapter. The first is neder. That's Hebrew for a vow. The second that you see there is shavua, and it's an oath. All right. Now, there's a difference between the 2. They're not exactly the same. So let me just explain that from the Hebrew and the Jewish perspective on this. Number 1, a vow. This is the biblical perspective. A vow is something that somebody takes to, and it can either be positive or negative. The positive would be also another word that would be used as a pledge, and it would be to do something extra. For example, like a free will offering. People were obligated, as to give tithes. 10%. That's what a tithe is. But a free will offering is something extra. You don't have to. You're not obligated, but you choose to do that. That would be covered as a positive vow or pledge. On the sort of negative, in the sense of a prohibition, would we look at an example would be the Nazirite vow, where the person is saying that a certain thing, which is normally okay, would now be prohibited to them for a period of time. And in the case of the Nazirite vow, for example, wine, normally wine or grape juice or even grapes, it's okay, it's kosher. But for the period of the Nazirite vow, it is now as if that is now not permissible, not kosher. So with the vow, it has to do with the thing. It's either prohibited, like the food or whatever, or it's an extra thing that you fulfill that you don't have to, like an offering, a free will offering. That's a vow. Whereas an oath has to do with the person. It has to do with swearing an oath. You will do something. So the onus is on the person. And it is also used in Jewish law and in the Torah with regards to swearing testimony. We also have that even today in our modern courts and so on, swearing to tell the truth, etc. That's that idea. So these are 2 different things. Now, one of the questions that is also asked by believers, well, what about what did Yeshua say? Because here in the Torah, it seems as we see that oaths and vows are allowed. But one of the questions is, well, didn't Yeshua say you shouldn't do this at all? And the key passage, one of the key passages is Matthew 5, verses 33 to 37, where Yeshua, it's the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall carry out your oaths to Adonai." Well, the first point I want to make about this passage in Matthew 5 is he is dealing with the second one of these, the shavua, the oath. And he's basically saying not to perjure yourself, which means to swear falsely, give false testimony, or even say you're going to do something but not to do it. That's swearing falsely. He's not dealing with the vow, the neder. See, it wouldn't make sense if Yeshua was to contradict the Torah and say, well, when God gave us the Torah, that wasn't right, and I'm canceling that. We shouldn't do that. That's not what he's dealing with in the Sermon on the Mount. What he's dealing with is what we'd call a rash vow, especially an oath, swearing falsely, perjuring yourself, or making a rash oath or a vain oath. Also, he's dealing with, and this was something that was in rabbinic thought at the time, that you could, some people were saying you could make an oath, and if you swore by Jerusalem or by the temple, that would strengthen your oath. But Yeshua was teaching us in Matthew 5 not to do that, and that what we are to be is people of integrity. So in other words, when we say we are going to do something, we will do it, and when we don't, we don't. And that is enough. That's sufficient. Your yes should be yes, your no should be no. You don't need to swear by something else. And it actually could be a sin, really, because if you can't carry out something, that is not good. And that's actually what's being addressed here in Numbers chapter 30, in a sense, too, is the idea of rash vows or oaths that's mentioned here. So let's look at it. Let's go back to Numbers 30 right now. I just want to mention too, there are other examples in the literature of the time around, between the writing of the Tanakh and Matthew and so on, where this idea is talked about, rash oaths, and it was generally understood that was not, that's not good. And so I think we would all agree with that. So back to Numbers 30. So what is being dealt with here in Numbers 30 is specifically, it starts with when a man makes a vow to Adonai or swears an oath to obligate himself. That's in verse 2. Then it goes to deal with a woman in her youth, and it deals with whether she's under her father's authority and protection, or if she's married, she's under her husband's authority. Now, I want to explain that. First of all, within the Torah, what this is saying, this is dealing with people who are of marriageable age, or in other words, they're not children at this point. They're old enough to be married. And what is understood here is that if a son is of marriageable age, he's responsible for his own oaths or vows. So if he makes a vow or an oath, he's responsible to carry that out. It says he is not to violate his word, but to do everything coming out of his mouth. And to do otherwise is basically, there's guilt involved with that. If you said you're going to do it and you don't, and this is to the Lord, by the way, to Adonai, there would be guilt. So now also there'd be ways of being, there's forgiveness. So, but it's still seen as being essentially a sin. Now, a daughter, on the other hand, who's of marriageable age, is still under the authority and protection of her father. Now, some would say, well, it doesn't seem fair. Well, really, if you think of it in one way, it's not fair for the son because he's on his own. If he does say something, he is responsible. Whereas the daughter, if she says something, and again, the issue really is if it was something rash, or she just said it in the moment, she's obligated to do that. But her father, in the day that he hears of it, can revoke it. So he has that authority, and it's really a protective relationship that he has to, to keep his daughter safe from something that might be harmful to her. So that's really what is being discussed here. And at the so and these are statutes that Adonai is giving to Moses, it says in verse 16, relevant to the relationships between a man and his wife, as well as between a father and his young daughter still living in his house. So again, it's very clear. Now, another interesting thing, though, is that it clearly teaches us here that when the daughter does marry, in verse 6, it says, verse 6, she should, if suppose she should marry after her vow or rash promise of her lips by which she obligated herself. So again, it's dealing with not just any vow, or it's an unwise one, a rash one. It says, now if her husband hears about it, but says nothing to her on the day that he hears about it, her vows will stand. So if he says nothing, she's still responsible. There's a principle here, I think, that if we hear of something that could end up becoming a sin, and it could end up becoming harmful to a person, we all are obligated to say something when we hear of it. If we let it go, we're letting it stand, And towards the end of this passage, it says in verse 14 and 15, but if her husband says nothing to her from day to day, then he is confirming all her vows and her oaths that are on her. He confirms them by saying nothing to her on the day of his hearing about it. And then, but if he nullifies it later, after hearing about it, he will bear her guilt. In other words, he has to nullify it right away and revoke it right away. If he lets it go on and then he sort of says, well, I nullify it now, that doesn't work. He will bear the guilt, you see. So there's this aspect of authority, but there's also great responsibility, and he would actually be bearing the guilt if his wife made a vow that she couldn't carry out. It would be on him unless he revokes it. He's able to revoke it, you see, but it has to be the day that he hears about it. So these are the main issues that are dealt with here. We see this sort of headship principle of there's a special relationship between a father and his daughter even until she is married. We also know that we can see in this passage, and I think it's a universal principle, that in general, parents have spiritual authority over their children, whether boys or girls, when they're children. Okay. Now, by the way, when we look at this, we see this reflected in our society, even to this day, that, when see one vow would be a pledge to be engaged or to be married. And what is being taught here in the Torah is that actually the father has the final say. Now, we still see this somewhat today. Traditionally, people ask for the permission to marry the daughter or ask for her hand in marriage. We see that it's the father who walks the bride down the aisle to, give her away, so to speak. And so that's very much reflected there. The father would still have the final say on who she could marry. Now, again, our worldview is changed somewhat, and society is a bit different, but we still do see this reflected. We want the blessing of the father on the marriage. And so we still do see that. Now, these are the main areas that are covered here. And I think there, again, are some universal principles that we can look at in terms of, first of all, we should only, if we're going to say we're going to do something, especially as to the Lord, then we should carry it out. Otherwise, we should be careful about what we say. We should either, as Yeshua said, let your yes be yes and your no be no. That is very important. Now, again, Yeshua was not canceling this biblical idea of vows. We know that later on in the New Covenant, in the book of Acts, the early believers still did the Nazirite vow and so on. So he wasn't canceling that, but he was talking about not swearing rashly or vainly. That is also what's being discussed here. But there was a way of protection for daughters who were still under their father's care. And then we also see this idea that when both husband and wife leave their parents and are joined together, they now form a new family unit and they are responsible to each other now. And so this is all within, by the way, this headship principle is all very much consistent with the teaching of the apostles, with Yeshua. It's discussed in Ephesians 5. It's discussed in Colossians, in Titus, in 1 Peter chapter 3. The idea that husbands have this headship role. And it goes back even to the first couple, Adam and Eve, and how Adam was really responsible, even though it was, when we read the story, Eve was the one that was first tempted and so on, but Adam was responsible for that. He bore the guilt. It's, sin came through Adam. That's written in scripture. He was the one. But so that relationship is there, and we see that it's also a picture of Messiah and the congregation, the body of believers. He's the groom, we are the bride. So that is a picture that's there in the biblical worldview. And it's important for us to realize, well, that's all I want to share right now regarding this Torah portion. And there's a lot to think about and to meditate on as to our words and the meaning of our words and being people of integrity, and also our relationships with one another, and that headship principle and the spiritual authority that fathers have, but that parents also, I would say, both have over their children to protect them spiritually, and also husbands and wives to one another. Having said that, clearly the biblical worldview is that the father is the head of the house and the husband, but it's clearly taught that there's equality though, but there's that responsibility that God intended to be there. So thank you for joining this evening, and bless you. Shalom. And I look forward to seeing you all on Shabbat morning at 10:30. We're going to continue our study on Galatians. We're getting into chapter 6. So look forward to seeing you then. Remember to like and share this video and subscribe as well to this channel so you can get notifications when we do new videos. Bless you. See you soon.